Stephen, great to have you on, sir. Welcome to Chasing Poker Greatness.
Oh, great to be here. Good to be on here, Brad.
To start out, as I do with all of the guests that come on the podcast, come on the show, let's talk about your journey into the world of poker. How did you find the world of poker, and what'd your journey look like?
Wow. Long and twisted road. I came to poker relatively late. I started off my life as a lawyer. Went to university, went to law school. And my real passion at that point in my life was the law, helping people, fighting cases. I loved it. And I then, after being what we call in the UK a barrister, which is like the guys who go into court. If you've seen old style courtroom dramas, the guys with the wigs and gowns.
Oh yeah, I've seen Broadchurch. I've seen it.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that was. I really loved that. And then I had my two boys. They're now grown up, and I realized that was going to absorb that particular career was going to absorb a lot of my time because I effectively worked pretty well every day of the week. And I decided I wanted to change. And within the law, I became the other side of the legal profession in the UK, which is the people who a little bit more office based, a little bit more control of your time, a solicitor. And I was one of four guys who formed a law firm. And the law firm really, succeeded almost beyond our wildest dreams. But I got to the point where within the law, I realized that I was no longer really doing what I loved. I loved being in court. That was the truth. And I also loved having that real connection with the clients. And as you develop a business, sometimes the business just grows and grows and grows. And you almost realize that it's got bigger than you kind of realized it at the time. And everything just became numbers. And this was around, I guess it was around 2008. I just became aware of online poker around that time. So yeah, sorry, go on, lad.
No, what was it about being in the courtroom that appealed to you so much?
Okay, so this is interesting. I love competition, and this is one of the things that's driven me to poker. I played a lot of sport growing up, and really my life just, at one point I was thinking, would professional sport be something for me? But I sort of took, I guess, what was the safe option, went into, a career in the law, and I enjoyed competing in court. I liked winning. But that sort of itch was never truly scratched by the law. And yeah, as I say, coming back to how I got to playing poker, I guess it would have been about 2008 that I became aware of online poker. And I suppose I had an initial experience like a number of people. I started playing everything, sit and goes, MTTs, cash games, not really knowing what I was doing, needless to say. And there was a competition in this country. There was a magazine called Poker Player, and they had like an online league. And it was I think it was about 5,000 people or something entered it. And the top 100 got through to a live final. It was the first time I played live poker. And I won it. And I got a ticket for the World Series of Poker Europe. And, somewhat naively, having won my first live tournament, I thought, well, okay, good chance of winning a second, right?
Easy.
That's the way it works, right?
Piece of cake, yeah.
And like I sat down at this table, it was a load of people I've recognized from watching. By this time I was watching, stuff on television, and it was like Barry Greenstein and Nenad Medic and, Solomitsi, all these people at the table. Turned out I was like basically the only amateur, the only recreational player there. And very nicely, they tore me limb from limb.
Yeah.
They were so beautifully polite about it, because obviously I was a donator, and at that point I realized, okay, if I want to be decent at this, I'm going to have to put in a bit of effort. And really, I kind of really got into it, played a lot of cash. Back in the day, it was card runners, juices cracked. Sort of Vanessa Selks was on Juices Cracked at that time. I remember watching her videos, Matthew Jander on card runners. And I was playing cash games and I was making money at the cash games. Um, and then I decided at one point, you know what? I've had enough of the law. I don't want to just see out the rest of my working days in the law. And I said, right, we'll sell my share of the business and become a professional poker player, which I think most people who knew me were like, what are you thinking of? But it felt like the right choice for me. And I
Were
basically
you
spent,
married at the time?
yes, yeah, with my
With
two
kids?
young, yeah, that's right. And yeah, I spent,
How did that conversation go? Because to be on a fly in the wall, honey, I'm selling my shares of the business, and I'm gonna play poker professionally.
and I think this is an important thing. My wife was very supportive. She knew that this was what I wanted to do. She knew that the law was no longer what I wanted to do. And she basically said, I trust you, to actually make a success of this. And yeah, I suppose I spent the best part of a decade. I started off playing cash, really discovered that eventually NTTs was what I loved the most. And, I basically, a real turning point for me was getting performance and mindset coaching myself because, I had a lot of technical coaching, but I was definitely finding that there was this gap between what I knew and what I was actually producing at the tables. And, I got to the point where I thought I've got to find an answer as to why I'm not executing the way my knowledge should be allowing. And I, reached out to Elliot Rowe, and it really was a game changer for me. I started not making the same mistakes I was making at the tables. I mean, the specific one, which really prompted me to do it, was I was basically getting to spots, particularly on the river, where I was maybe facing a raise with an objectively or an absolutely strong hand, and I was not finding the folds. Everything I knew was pointing me in the direction of, sorry, this is a fold. Because as you probably know, the population doesn't find many river raise bluffs. And I went through all the Jared Tendler stuff and like I came up with all the logical reasons why I shouldn't be calling in those spots. But the trouble with the way our emotions work is they overwhelm our logic. And you don't get time to inject all of the logic in those spots. And it was only when I had this kind of coaching that I stopped making those calls. And the effect was almost instantaneous. And what I also found was I became a lot less anxious generally, and a lot more relaxed and calm in all aspects of my life. And that really was a game changer for me. So that sort of then propelled me forwards. And basically, 10 years later, I decided what I really loved was the coaching, because that experience really made me realize it was fascinating to me. I mean, the area of law I specialized in at the end of my career was brain and psychological injuries. And I was fascinated by what this work with Elliot had done to me. And I looked a little more deeply into his methodologies, which really weren't part of medical mainstream. And to be clear, what I do and what he does is not therapy in the conventional sense, but it uses hypnotherapy as a technique. And it turns out there's a huge amount of science supporting it. And I think for me, it was like seeing was believing. And all of that fascinated me. And I loved working with people. By the end, I was also doing poker coaching within a stable. But I found like the psychology of it and actually observing myself, my own mental leaks was actually really interesting. And that's why I became a coach.
Yeah, I love Jared Tindler, and the Mental Game of Poker has been cited on the podcast as a very influential book to many of my guests. The bone that I have to pick with Tindler and his methodology is the injecting logic portion of it, where yeah, I think that like as emotional creatures, we've all been in a heightened state of emotion through, just various things that happen to us in our lives. And it's not as simple as injecting logic to overcome such high emotional states, right? Your kid gets sick, that your kid falls off her bike and gets hurt or breaks her arm, and you got to go to the hospital. Just somebody in your family dies, and it's very traumatic and emotional, and devastating, and you can't just inject logic. Well, everybody dies. This had to happen at some point. They lived a long life. These are all logical arguments that can't actually you can't override your emotional state. I don't think, and I'm very thankful that you can't, because I love that we have emotions. I lean into my emotions. I love feeling my emotions. Without the suffering and the sadness, you can't feel the happiness and joy of life. And I think that in a lot of ways, that's just one of the things that life is worth living for. And poker brings up a lot of anxiousness, a lot of emotions that you just can't override in the moment. And so, yeah, like there has to be some other answer besides logic, because logic doesn't lead you to responding accurately in real time, because the emotions just kind of distort everything and get in the way.
100%. I mean, I think the injecting logic idea is useful as a starting point. In other words, you bring an awareness of your own flawed thinking in the moment, but it's not the complete answer for the reasons you've stated. And what happens is our subconscious is so quick acting. It's designed. What's effectively happening here is we've got an evolutionary program, a fight, flight, or freeze program. And it's been very useful in human evolutionary terms. It keeps us alive. It's never disappeared, though, and it still gets involved in lots of decisions today. And maybe once in a while, hopefully not, there may be a situation where it is useful to have a fight, flight, or freeze response. I mean, if you've ever stepped off a pavement briefly without looking, and then you hear a car coming to your either side of you, you don't want your slow thinking brain to go, oh, let me just work out what my response should be here. You want your subconscious fight, flight, or freeze mechanism to say, get me back on that pavement without so much as a moment's thought.
It's like a seatbelt, right? Like
exactly.
not often useful, but when you need it, you really, really need it.
Exactly. Now, the thing is, though, that at the poker table, that fight, flight, or freeze response is clearly an overreaction. Nothing is going to happen, hopefully ever, at the poker table, which requires a true fight, flight, or freeze response. At the same time, you're right. I mean, firstly, you're right in saying the emotional signals, they're part of what give us joy. I mean, why do we enjoy playing poker? Okay, sure. Eventually, if you become a professional, it's to make money. But look, if you play poker tournaments, you probably enjoy winning. That is a joyful feeling in itself. And you're right. So that's the upside of emotions. You enjoy it. Without the lows, you don't get the highs. But also those emotional signals are incredibly useful if you can harness them. The difficulty is just trying to use conscious logic to control what are effectively subconscious responses makes no sense. Most clients who come to me already know consciously what they should be doing, but they find themselves not doing it. That was the same for me when I first got this kind of coaching myself. I knew I shouldn't just be mashing that call button when I was raised on the river, but no amount of telling myself that every day, and I did tell myself it every day.
And I'm sure instantly, before you click the call button, you told it to yourself.
Like 3 seconds later, you got your hands on your head, like, how has it come to this again? And this is not an uncommon pattern. Had a client this morning, and we were, funny enough, it was River Races, professional player, and he said, I found myself in the moment rationalizing why I should call. But actually there was no indicators to say this is anything other than what we generally expect from the general population here. If you're playing great players, they'll find those river bluff raises. Like the average, recreational is not going to find them. And we did some work on that, but it was, again, the conscious logic was there. They already knew it. They didn't need me to say, inject some logic here. They had it. The only thing that makes sense to address what is a subconscious response is a subconscious modality of coaching. And that's what hypnotherapy is. It addresses the subconscious. And what's really interesting about the subconscious is it's a state of very open learning. I mean, up to about the age of 6 to 8, as children, we are mostly in a theta brainwave state, and that is a heavy learning state. Think about what you learn in those first few years of your life. And what happens in hypnotherapy is we effectively put you into a relaxed brainwave state, and your brain becomes very open to new ways of thinking.
Could you define hypnotherapy in a practical way? Because I think that, when I hear hypnotherapy, and maybe the listener too, I think of like maybe the snake in the Jungle Book that just is like holding and his eyes are turning and hypnotizing someone. So yeah, could you break that down for the listener? And
yeah, absolutely. And I understand, and I think that sort of image then has created a perception that it's woo-woo bullshit. Let's be honest. And look, I come from a medico-legal background. I had to be able to cross-examine psychiatrists and psychologists. And so when I first looked into this, I was like, okay, I went into it with a pretty healthy skepticism. For anybody who's interested, there's a guy called Dr. David Spiegel. He's an MD psychiatrist, practicing psychiatrist, and also an academic at Stanford University. And Stanford University did an amazing study on the effects of hypnotherapy. And with modern brain scanning techniques, we're able to understand what's going on in the brain a lot more. And what happens is when we have certain responses, the brain effectively has neural pathways which governs what we're doing. So if something happens to us at a certain point in our life, for example, let's say you touch something very hot as a child, your brain will very quickly create a neural pathway which says, don't do that again. It happens with other experiences as well. And that's why our brain then says, okay, well, don't do that, do this instead. But some of the lessons we learn, the brain produces maladaptive responses. So, it's well documented that there's lots of subconscious responses which are suboptimal. For example, we are risk averse generally. And that's another evolutionary response. We're in a relative comfort zone as humans now, and it doesn't make sense to take chances. But at the poker table, aggression often pays, and that often means taking some chances. But there's that goes against a lot of our wiring, but that wiring is not set. Basically, the concept of neuroplasticity is now well understood. It used to be we thought, okay, once we are wired a certain way, that's it. We're stuck there. All the evidence is that's not true. And the Stanford study basically showed that in response to hypnotherapy, the neural structures of the brain changed in a beneficial way. And that's why David Spiegel himself, although he's a psychiatrist who can use all sorts of, basically every tool under the sun, uses hypnotherapy as his, number one tool of choice. So what happens in hypnotherapy? It's not mind control in the way that it's often perceived, in the way you describe it. It's definitely not the kind of stuff you see on stage where people are barking like dogs and all that kind of stuff. All we do is we get your mind into a relaxed state, a theta brainwave state. And in that state, it is, as I've already mentioned, open to new ways of thinking in a way that isn't normally true when you're in a less relaxed brainwave state. So I could sit here with you in a beta brainwave state, a state of focus, and I could say, hey, Brad, to use the example I've given. Make sure you're making those foals versus unknowns and recreationals to river races. And you can say, yeah, yeah, yeah. But your subconscious brain is going to still say, yeah, but I've got a really strong hand, and I don't like accepting losses because that's a
What if
move.
they show a bluff? What if they show a bluff?
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. And it's really hard for the brain to accept if they did show a bluff, right? So you're trying to train your brain to accept what is effectively a probabilistic population exploit. But then the brain says, "Oh, there you go. I told you I should have called because this is the guy who's shown me a bluff." The fact of the matter is that guy's probably the exception. But what we effectively do is we get the brain to just relax and accept a different way of approaching this problem. What I tend to do with most clients is if they've got a particular response to a situation that they know they should be doing something, but they're not doing it, we will use regression therapy. And what that does is it takes their response in that situation, it traces it back to find out where it came from. And it usually comes from somewhere in the past. My own issue, which I described, was something from my childhood where it sounds bizarre, but I got off a plane and my ears hadn't popped. And I panicked and I was banging my head against the floor. And when this memory popped up, I was like, what's going on here? This is wild. What's this got to do with me not pitting fold? But lo and behold, the next session, those problems were not happening, and they didn't happen again. It was too great a coincidence for it, because I tried everything up to that point. And effectively what my mind was doing was saying, this is a situation which you are finding stressful, get out of it fast. I wish it had got out of it fast by allowing me to fold quickly rather than call quickly. But hey, you don't get to choose these things. But I think effectively what was happening there was the very common cognitive bias of sunk cost fallacy coming in. In other words, I'd already invested this much money. I've got a strong hand. Hell, let's just see that I'm beaten here. But effectively what happens with the hypnotherapy, as I say, is we trace where that pattern of thinking has come from, and we basically change the structures of the brain. It's very interesting because what's creeping into, it's becoming the cutting edge of treatment for anxiety and depression is psychedelics. And when you actually think about the methodology there, it's very similar. What happens is the psychedelics are relaxing the conscious mind. They're basically getting your conscious mind out of the way and making you open to a different way of thinking. And it's very similar with hypnotherapy, except we're not using any psychedelics.
Psilocybin, mushrooms, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. We just basically using imagery, certain words to actually relax the brain.
Yeah, it's interesting to me how science in a lot of these cases, and for what it's worth, for me, had I gone through the experience and then had a resolution directly after, I wouldn't need the science to make me feel one way or the other about the hypnotherapy session, because the proof is in the pudding, as they say. And I think a lot of times, like even with meditation, science has finally caught up with meditation, but when you do it and you experience the benefits of afterwards of doing it, honestly, it doesn't matter to me if it like, even if it were a placebo, it wouldn't matter as long as the problem got solved, right? Because that's the thing that ultimately I think we're all searching for, is a solution to these problems that are happening kind of over and over and over and over again. We get in these patterns that we can't disrupt, such as, bluff catching too much on the river in nodes that are underbluffed. And we know they're underbluffed, and we probably have evidence specifically that they're underbluffed because of all the times we call. We have a lot of data points that are leading us in one direction, and yet we still find ourselves bluff catching in this spot. Anything that would resolve that issue is beneficial. And I think anybody that plays enough poker and has these reoccurring issues should be willing to explore almost any path to resolve them, healthily. And is not really there's so many examples of hypnotherapy being beneficial to players that yourself and Elliot have coached over the years. Fedor Holtz, Anton Wig, who's a friend of the CPG podcast. He's been on a number of times. There's so many high level players that speak to the results of hypnotherapy that I think if you're in the poker space and you find yourself falling into these patterns, you would it'd almost be foolish not to explore them, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, yeah, Fedor's a great example. I work with Fedor's sort of cohort of mentees and these people, when somebody like Fedor invests in this, it's a pretty solid sign that, he's a believer and he's a pretty rational guy. And it definitely, the evidence is there. And as I say, for people who are interested in saying, well, wait a minute, is this, you're right. I mean, if it was placebo, who cares? But actually there is more substantial evidence anyway. As I say, for anybody who wants to look into it further, just Google Dr. David Spiegel and you'll get chapter and verse on it. But yeah, and this is the trouble. I think the reality is this. It took me a while to recognize this because I think a lot of poker players, this was thinking back to when I started, I was investing a lot of time and money in technical poker coaching. And to be clear, that is always going to be an important component of a professional's investment. You have to be looking to improve the whole time.
Which is my realm, right?
Yeah,
but
exactly.
When somebody comes to me with that problem and they ask, like, why do I keep calling even though I know I shouldn't call, right? The technical side falls short. It's like, I can say, well, you're routinely making a mistake and you should not do that. But I can't offer them a direct solution myself.
No, exactly. Exactly. So, for example, I would say to a player, if a player comes to me, and this is remarkable how often this is the case, a player will come to me saying, and by the way, bluff catching on the river is almost the most common, I would say, problem, where somebody's bluff catching too much. But the other one actually is not bluffing enough in certain spots, particularly big pot spots. And I will say to them, well, the first thing you've got to sort out is to have technical knowledge and clear heuristics as to what you want your thought process to be in that moment. And we will do some work, and I work with clients on saying, okay, what is the best way of integrating that knowledge into your head? Because I think a lot of poker players spend huge amounts of time doing solver work, watching videos. And what they hope will happen in moments where they're under pressure is that their brain will be able to go into all the filing cabinets of their knowledge and pull it out neatly and produce a nice solution. Unfortunately, the brain doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like ChatGPT. It tries to save energy. And if there's a big pressure moment and there's a lot of information to process, the brain will say, I kind of forget all that. I'm going to use my heuristics here. And quite often, unless you've trained your brain well, the heuristics will be driven by emotional biases, cognitive biases. So you have to start with a good technical understanding of how to think about a spot. You've got to understand, and this is going to be different for everybody. I'll always say to the client, it's important that you create a heuristic which speaks to you in the right way. But you want to have some clarity. I was doing some work with a client in the last week on their river bluff catching heuristic. Starting with, okay, categorize my opponent. Are they the kind who's likely to over bluff, under bluff? Then we might, if we're not sure, what happens then? Well, is this an under bluffed or an over bluff spot? And then, then we start working from there into some finer details. Other clients have said to me, particularly those who are playing in a live context, I want to give some weight to live tells. And, we can build that into the heuristic, but that's the starting point. But what we then want is to basically integrate that into a usable process, which they can access under pressure. And what I will actually do with my clients is, firstly, I'll find what the source of why they respond emotionally in this spot. And we'll do the kind of work I mentioned before, regression. But what I'll usually also do is then create, for each client, I create an MP3 for each situation. And I get them to mentally see themselves and hear themselves going through their heuristic in the spot. And the repetition there is effectively building the new neural pathway in the brain. In other words, we're trying to get rid of the old emotional response, and we're trying to now create a new upgraded kind of heuristic. The old emotional heuristic was not helpful, so we need to replace it with something. But the brain can't just work in a vacuum. It has to have good technical knowledge. But I think at the heart of performance coaching, you've got this problem. And as I say, this is something that took me about a year into my professional career to realize that I suppose every professional, if you were to say on a scale of 0 to 100, how good is your technical skills? How good are your technical skills? And what can you perform? What level can you perform at the table? You might say, okay, to an entry level professional might be 70 out of 100. And maybe the best in the world are hitting 90 plus. Nobody's at 100. Let's be honest. No, but it gets harder and harder to get those extra percentages technically. But people will pour a huge amount of time and resources into the technical work and completely ignore the mental game side. And let's say you're an 80 out of 100 player in terms of what you could execute if you executed your technical knowledge. You'll get people who are pouring a huge amount to get that extra 1 and 2%, which is important, but they'll ignore the fact that on many days they'll fall from 80 to 60 or 50 or 40 because their mind is not working in the right way. And that's a massive leak.
It's
a
huge.
Leak. Yeah.
There's a quote. I started training jujitsu like a year and a half ago, and John Danaher, who's one of the, maybe the most well-respected, greatest of all time jujitsu coach, has a saying that it's not about how many moves you know, it's about how many moves you know under pressure. And in the poker sense, it applies as well. And I would also say on the technical side of things, as it relates to performance, the technical side is typically done in a very sterile environment that has very predictable variables. Whereas when you actually play poker, it's way more chaos. There's this need to perform at a high level and problem solve in real time and adapt to situations that you've probably never studied before, because no solver has an output for such a situation, right? Especially as it relates to amateur poker players that you're playing against. Typically, you can predict what better poker players are going to do at a reasonably high clip. As it relates to amateurs, things kind of they're a wild card, that things get messy, they get chaotic. And so even if you are theoretically a very high level poker player, you need to be able to problem solve, critically think, and adapt in real time. And I'm not saying that amateurs are more difficult to play against. I'm just saying they have more variables that are unaccounted for in your theoretical study that mean it's critical to perform at a very, very high level in these situations that are quite dynamic and fluid.
Yeah, that's 100% true. And this is one of the actually the challenges, I think, of working with solvers. And this was an interesting aspect for me when I went through a phase of doing a huge amount of solver work. Actually, a guy who changed my perception and really uplifted my career, and I've got to give him credit, was Chris Kruk, Apotheosis. He was really somebody who made me realize, wow, how far you've got to come. And after that, I got really into the solver work. But then an interesting pattern I observed in myself, only really with hindsight, but also in a lot of players who come to me, is you do a huge amount of solver work and you come kind of attached to sticking to the solutions that the solver gets you, and you're like, the spots where you've got to deviate really radically from that, but there's a big emotional resistance to it because it's like, well, yeah, but this is theoretically correct and it feels safe. If I do this, nobody can say I'm wrong. Well, yes, they can, because against the kind of opponent you're playing, you can't assume the same kind of ranges and responses that GTO Wizard would give you. And so part of being a good player is actually having that mental agility to say, I know what the solution is, but I also know why I should depart from it and when I should depart from it. Um,
Yeah,
you know,
Justin Justin
yeah,
Saliba Justin Saliba has came on the podcast, and his big saying is that you want your brain to be a solver, right? Like you want to be able to think like a solver does so that you can adapt in real time to the variables that are in play. And the way I think about it in my head is, it's like a dial, a volume dial on a stereo. I guess I'll date myself. You know, if aggression cranks up here, my response needs to change to this. If aggression is cranked down, my response needs to shift to this. If my opponents are under bluffing by 20%, my response needs to be this. Like, who is this player? Do I think they're under bluffing? Do I think they're over bluffing? And then essentially be able to output a map of a strategic map in the moment, and then follow that map based on, the additional data points that you get when you're playing against actual live, living, fallible, and flawed human beings, which the very best players in the world, every human being that you play against, unless they're cheating, has an exploitable strategy. They are not following GTO outputs 100%, which means that oftentimes there are better solutions than the GTO output.
absolutely. And this is a skillful way to use the GTO output, but it does involve not just absorbing the technical output, but also creating a mental space which allows you to adapt. Say, okay, I understand that that's what the baseline is, but what if this person here is doing more of this and less of that? I then adjust in this way. And this really all comes back to what really performance coaching is about. I mean, there was a guy years back, many years back, a chess player called Siegbert Tarash. He's come up with all sorts of great quotes, but the one I like most is, it's not enough to be a good player, you must also play well.
Oh, I love that one. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was after a chess tournament where he basically went and probably looked at it by the sounds of it and thought, I should beat these guys, and came away thinking, okay, what happened there then? I didn't. And chess is, of course, a game of pure skill. It hasn't got that element of luck, which poker has. But he recognized that there is this gap between what we know technically and how we execute. And, coming back to the application of that in poker, I had a client I did a session with a few weeks ago. And, again, he'd come from a very GTO driven background. And he had almost an emotional response to players playing badly against him. And he would think, no, these are spots where you should be doing this and I should be doing that. And I was sort of saying to him, well, you understand that that's not a rational way to look at it. It doesn't matter what you think he should be doing. The question is, what is he doing? And it's your job to think of that. And interestingly, the client was quite an artistic client. He's into his music. He's, was a professional musician. And I sort of said, do you think that good music is just playing the piece of music on the sheet in exactly the way it's written, or do you think sometimes it can be adaptive? What do you think about somebody in a flow state? They'll often improvise, and I think this is what happens with good poker players. They have that freedom to not just stick to a script. They'll understand the script at a deep level, but then they have that mental freedom. But you have to get rid of a lot of bullshit, basically, sometimes with some players, to actually enable them to say, oh, yep, okay, I understand what the theory is here, but I am able to adapt completely and freely. And I don't mind adapting and, maybe making a bluff and walking home early. That's okay. I'm not just going to stick to that. Or the opposite, I might make the fold here, even though it's painful. But this is the heart of what we do.
Yeah, I learned a very long time ago, as a early 20-something-year-old, that if I got on my whiteboard and I wrote, like, okay, so normally my goal is 1,000 hands a day. If I play 3,500 hands a day, and this is my win rate, this is how much money I'm going to win in a day. This is like the expectation. And so what ended up happening every single time I went about playing poker in that way was I would show up, I would sit down, and I would just be there. Like I had this sense that like, oh, I just sit in my chair and I'm gonna win, and like because that's what happens over the long run. And I forgot that, oh yeah, you actually have to try and invest significant amounts of mental energy to playing well over those 3,500 hands, which by the way was way beyond my limit. So I was conserving energy to stretch my 1,000 hand goal into 3,500 hand goal, which meant I was playing at a lower level, which meant that I actually wasn't supposed to win as much money as when I played only 1,000 hands a day, because I just was performing at a very low level. And I think that's like, it's such an easy logical trap to fall into that like, oh, my win rate is X. If I play X amount of hands, I'm going to win this amount of money today. And then you just forget like, oh yeah, I actually have to like sit down, claw, scrape, fight for every single big blind and every single pot, because my opponents, they're not just going to give me the money. Like I actually have to play well, and not just show up and sit down and play. And I think that's, kind of alludes to the chess quote. And it's just such an easy trap for poker players to fall into, just feeling this need, compulsion to just go in like this autopilot mode and forget that like, oh yeah, I actually have to like make high level decisions routinely. That's what gives me my edge. I have to play a little bit differently than everybody else. I've got to see the data points more clearly, prioritize the right things so that I can actually realize my edge. And that takes effort. And like it is extremely mentally draining to play poker at a high level over a long period of time. So anyway, that's my little spiel on like, it's not enough to know how to play well. You also have to play well. That's how it works in the poker space, at least for me.
Absolutely. I mean, you touched on another important point and a big leak I think a lot of players have, which is, they look at the table and they say, I've got an edge. I look at these players, I've got an edge. But the question is, at this point in time, have you got an edge? So you might, at the start of a session, have that edge. You might be mentally sharp. But, I've got clients, for example, who play in Macau. And some of those days they play out there are pretty long. I can think of one client, and you have to get there early in the morning, and you have to basically reg battle for most of the day until the VIPs turn up much later in the day. And, it's a trial of endurance, and your theoretical EV against those players may be huge in principle, but how huge is it if you are 12, 13, 14 hours into your session? It's not static. Your EV is not static. And one of the things that's really difficult is for a player in real time, and again, there's an emotional program often involved here, of saying, do you know what? I recognize that my EV is no longer enough for me to sit in this game. And that can be for a variety of things. Part of the work I do with clients is making sure their EV doesn't drop because of short-term variance. We don't want to be walking away from the table every time we've had a couple of bad beats. But equally, I think it's smart to recognize, if you've been playing too long, you can at some point actually start burning through the profits you've made at an earlier part in the day against the same opponents. People don't always want to accept that. Even when you sit down and talk through it and they accept it consciously, subconsciously in the moment, their mind, particularly if they're down for the day, their mind can say, hey, I've got an edge against these guys. I'm going to stay here for the next couple of hours. And guess what? That doesn't always work out very well.
How do you help your clients through that?
Well, again, I will actually do some hypno with that. Obviously, I think most of them can accept the logical case I just made out. And we'll also do work on, by the way, there's other things I will do to improve their mental stamina. I've mentioned hypnotherapy a lot, but another part of the training I have done and I bring to the table is flow states. And the ability to engage flow states is incredibly well proven scientifically. I qualified and mentored at the Flow Genome Project, and they work with people like Google, the Navy SEALs, Olympic athletes, lots of knowledge professionals. And what we know is that, in a flow state, you can improve your decision making in incredibly exponentially. Sort of, there's been studies showing you can improve your decision making by 430% in a flow state. Um, so I'll teach clients how to leverage that to maybe extend sessions. Obviously, you've got to look after yourself as well. And there's a whole load of work we do on making sure that they're doing all the right things so that their mental stamina improves and their physical stamina improves. But the other level is I will do some work on effectively working on their subconscious so that their brain does have that proper thought process around, hey, have I still got an edge now? Rather than, again, the emotions just saying, I want to stay because I'm losing. I want to stay. It doesn't even have to be because you're losing. It maybe I want to stay because, wow, I've just got a big edge here. Now, sometimes it's right. Sometimes you'll be tired, but you've got such a big edge, you should stay, But there'll be other times. I mean, I had one client in particular I can think of. And the game he played, what tended to happen was it went from No Limit Hold'em to PLO later in the night. And he still had an edge in PLO, but it was nothing like as great. And he also did tire significantly. And we actually looked at what was happening, and he was losing effectively during that later segment of the evening. But he wanted to stay, but he accepted logically when we went through it that he shouldn't. And what we did was some hypnotherapy, which basically allowed his mind to just say, hey, you can walk away. Because it was a game where he could come back every week. There was no problem. But he was effectively donating after a certain point in the evening. But we needed his subconscious to say, no, you don't have to stay. You're not missing out. And effectively he stopped. That problem stopped. But it was something I'm sure he consciously could have kind of worked out that he needed to leave, but he just wasn't doing it. And that was another case of the subconscious. The emotions take.
Yeah, I'm sure like just that manifesting in a coaching session is kind of a data point that's saying, hey, I kind of already have an idea of what's going on here, that this is what's happening, and just bringing it up in the first place, right? Because if there was no inkling that something was happening, you probably wouldn't talk about it. It probably wouldn't be a discussion point while working with you, right?
Let's be honest with you. I mean, most clients who come to me, they already have a pretty solid idea that something's going wrong, and they usually pretty shrewd idea roughly where it is. Sometimes it's a bit more generalized, but a lot of the time they come saying, hey, I'm doing this thing or these things. So they kind of don't need me to do the Jared Tendler exercise of, hey, let's go through the logic of why you're doing this.
Yeah.
It's helpful definitely to understand though that there is a detrimental mental program which is driving them in a certain direction. But yeah, effectively what we need to do is get to the subconscious reason why they're doing that. And unsurprisingly, it's not possible at a conscious level to work out what the subconscious or why the subconscious is doing what it's doing. All you can do is recognize it is doing it. Now let's go and get some therapy which effectively resolves that.
So going back to your story, you got Elliot as a coach. You hired Elliot. Things started moving in a positive direction. How did you go about, becoming qualified to be a coach with Elliot, right? Like to pursue that work.
Okay, so I went through. I was really interested in coaching, and I became a coach in the stable where I joined as a MTT player, and I became a coach in that stable, and I really discovered that I was loving the coaching aspect. It kind of made me realize that actually I'd always enjoyed that aspect. When I was in the law firm, I enjoyed mentoring people and helping them think about how to run cases in a different way. It's interesting. A lot of the same mental patterns were evident in lawyers, right? It's amazing how many litigators are scared to go to court. There's like that character in, I think it's The Simpsons, who just never wants to go to court, the weak lawyer. And I can't remember what his name is, but like you would see that in lawyers. They were scared, and you would coach them both in terms of how to take the technical steps just to keep the case going forwards towards court, but you would also coach them in the mental element. But what's going on there? I mean, at the end of the day, they were usually playing with my money, So like, why are you so scared? It wasn't like most of these lawyers were actually even standing up in court themselves. They were getting, barristers to do it for them. So why are you so scared? So I observed those patterns, but coming back to within poker. So Elliot, that had a big impact on me because, as I say, I saw the difference it made, and I then did some of the science on it and realized, wait a minute, this is a real thing. I've lived it, and now I understand it. I became a coach doing the technical work, but also, part of that is saying, hey, for example, you're seeing monsters under the bed here, and you're folding in these spots. So I became interested in the psychology. I then studied flow states. That was like really fundamentally at that point, it was an idea of just improving myself. One of the interesting things about flow states, incidentally, is what happens in the brain in a flow state is we get this thing called transient hypofrontality, which is a big way of saying the part of the brain associated with emotion and ego is actually somewhat downgraded, which is a good thing, obviously. The prefrontal cortex is also associated with, sort of a lot of logical thinking, but actually you can kind of overthink. That's what we know. We've all experienced this in poker, right? Where we kind of overthink. And what happens in flow states is we can just kind of get that part of the brain just to relax a little and allow you to just feel free. So I studied that, and then I became so interested in that. I approached Elliot, and Elliot, I said, I'm really interested in taking this coaching further. I'd like to broaden the horizons from just technical poker coaching to the mental side. And he said, I'll mentor you. He basically offered. And it's like, I don't know, it's like if you're a basketball player, Michael Jordan, saying, I'll take you under my wing, right? So I just thought, right, let's do that. And yeah, I mean, I still do some poker coaching alongside my mental game work, but now it's usually, so I'll maybe have a recreational client who comes to me and says, hey, I want to be better at poker, but I recognize there's technical and mental elements. And I'll look at a hand history, and what I'll usually be able to do is spot both problems, because quite often there's a mental game issue underlying some of the technical issues.
Sure.
But, if somebody really is all at sea technically, I'll usually point them in the direction of a technical coach at a certain point. But yeah, that's to be how I got into it. It just kind of almost evolved, as I just discovered that, I was just loving the coaching aspect.
Yeah, it's great. That's sick. Elliot takes you under his wing and helps you directly. That's right place, right time, right person. As you were, speaking about the flow state and how, it allows you to kind of get out of your own way at the poker table. It really reminded me of when I review play and explain videos for, I run a CFP. So I regularly train the same group of, 12 players on a weekly basis. We'll review play and explain videos, and a very interesting thing happens in the P&Es a lot of the time. They reach a decision point, typically on the river, and they start kind of listing their options or listing, the various paths they can take. Almost always the first option they list is the option that I would prefer them take, right? It would be my opinion that they take that option. But what happens is they list like 5 and then go with the very last option, which typically is like the worst of all the options. Trying to look at every single door and analyze every single possible door. And so as you were describing the flow state, it just made me realize, like, it's just like, you just since you have this feeling that this first option is the most obvious door, and you just take it, right? And you don't ruminate on the other doors and ultimately end up going down a path that, is suboptimal and leads to bad things, and then kind of walk away from that experience going like, why did I do that? Like, my first inclination was to do X. So how on earth did I land on Z? It's just an observation that I've noticed, and I think really hits home as to the importance of playing in flow and getting out of your own way when it comes to making high level decisions at the poker table.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is again where the technical side needs to be married with the mental side. It is good to be able to go through that mental checklist, but
Sure.
people, of here are the options. But equally, I think people do at times talk themselves into obscure lines, for all sorts of reasons. I mean, fancy play syndrome it comes from somewhere, right? What is the driver of that kind of response? And there's often a subconscious route to it. Somebody's trying to prove something, and again, we want to get that out of the way. So this combination of as I say, hypnotherapy will often identify. Well, we can use it to identify specific reasons why individuals respond in that way. What we're doing with the flow state science work is effectively leveraging what we know from mass biology, because effectively that's what's going on when we're studying flow states. We're studying the way certain neurochemicals are present in the brain in a flow state. It's specifically dopamine, norepinephrine. But it's interesting as well that like people talk about autopiloting being a bad thing in poker. It can be, and it frankly usually is, because people are just clicking buttons and just not really thinking about the way we talked before about adapting to specific opponents and situations. But interestingly, what happens in a flow state is you kind of are autopiloting, but you're autopiloting at a much more fluid and high level. So in other words, what you're doing is you automate that ability to be like water, to adapt. And that's one of the really great things about it. You don't overthink. You're completely present, and you just say, hey, what are the key data points here? You don't even have to actively think this. It's just part of you, and it just happens. And you will pick up that little thing, or you will cast it aside if it's not really important. You're not looking for some complicated solution to an easy problem.
Yeah.
But you have to train those mechanisms. This is the difficult. I mean, again, flow states, people think, okay, I'll go and click on YouTube and ask what are the flow triggers, and they think it's like taking a supplement. You've got to create a whole. Effectively, I don't want to make it sound too difficult, because it's actually a great way of running your life. It's actually a highly efficient way of running your life. But you create a lifestyle around being in flow. But if you can do that, you will make much better decisions, and it will be effortless. That's the beauty. But yeah, absolutely. What you described is just so typical of the overthinking problem. But there are solutions.
Yeah, and the flow state typically, how I feel when I'm in a flow state and playing poker is a lot of the rumination just kind of goes away. It's I fold in a spot, strong hand in an underbluffed scenario, underbluffed node, and I don't ruminate as to should I have called, should I have folded, should I have done anything else? Like, what if they bluff me? What if I learned that they're a volatile player and that I should have called? And then this is another kind of hallmark of play degradation that I see in play and explain videos is when a player can be playing perfectly, something happens that creates a sense of uncomfortability with their decision, and then they talk about that hand for the next 10 minutes, and their play degrades across all tables because they're so focused on ruminating on that one hand that gave them problems that their performance just drops kind of across the board. And if you can get rid of that, it is so incredibly helpful for stamina, high level decision making, and being consistent. Like I can't express how valuable um, being able to navigate those types of situations in a healthy way is.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, firstly, as you say, just being able to let go of a hand without a second thought almost, you know, you know, the important first thought was there. Okay, this is an underbluff node. I've got no reason to deviate from my knowledge of that. Okay, fine. Smile, smile. I know I've made a plus EV move. It doesn't matter if the guy happens to flick over a bluff. It's still a plus EV decision. The second thing you touched on there is really important. And again, this is something which humans struggle with, a solver doesn't, which is letting go of mistakes. Firstly, the solver doesn't make, in quotes, mistakes. But secondly, if it did, it wouldn't be bothered. It would just say, right, I'll just solve the next hand. But humans do hold on to that. And the ability to just bounce back from an error is absolutely, it's a superpower.
By the way, there is value in rumination, I think. At various points, there's a lot of value in rumination, especially after you play. Um, Understanding what went wrong, what you missed, what led to, a big blunder. It is important for us as human beings. Like the solvers, you're right. They don't need to. We need to upgrade the way that we think very often and think about things a little bit differently. So there is value in rumination. There's a time and a place to really go deeply and think about what you could have known or what could have changed the outcome. But generally that place is just not at the poker table. It doesn't serve you well to ruminate while you're in the middle of a session.
Yeah, and so I will work with clients on compartmentalizing in that way. It's not like, oh, forget it, it doesn't matter. Well, as you say, for your long-term development, those mistakes do matter, but you need to just be able to let it go. Accept that you are human, you will make mistakes. Or there'll be parts of the game tree where you're like, oh, wait a minute, I really don't know what to do here. Fine, make a note of it mentally or physically. But that is for later, as you say. That is not for now. And you see this in sport. I do work with some professional athletes as well, and the ability to just say, right, I made that mistake. It's okay. I just move on. Because you see it in sport where people make one mistake and it leads to a second and a third, and then effectively they've choked. So and it's the same mechanisms every time, and basically these techniques work. They work across all the realms I work in, with clients who are traders, with clients who are professional poker players, sports people, entrepreneurs. It's always the same kind of thought processes, which are helpful and unhelpful.
And something that you mentioned that just kind of sprang to mind too is in the spot where you fold in underbluff in an underbluffed node and you're in flow state and somebody shows you a bluff, right? In general, I think the time to learn is away from the poker table. But if a player does show you a bluff, I think you can approach that with curiosity and as a data point for the future to leverage against that exact opponent if that situation comes up again, either in that session or a future session.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Jason Sue's talked about this. Every hand's a sample of one. And but the trouble is, like, what do you take from that hand? Is that player going to do the same thing against you next time? But you're right. It is definitely good to reflect on that specific hand, but it's not right to say, okay, right, my mass data analysis goes out the window hereafter.
MDA knows even if a node is underbluffed, there are bluffs. They do exist. It is not 0%. It might be 3%. It might be 11%, which means 1 out of every 10 times you're going to get bluffed, right? And 10% outcomes happen all the time. Like they just happen everywhere. So you have to make peace with like, okay, this is an underbluff spot. And I think a lot of, what I was saying too also comes from paying attention to hands that you're not in and trying to identify anomalies before you get involved with the anomaly so that you can kind of respond appropriately. So anyway, yeah, it's I think Eric Seidel says it very well when he says less certainty, more inquiry, right? Just following following the compass of curiosity, and then asking yourself if there's anything valuable you should take away from that, taking what's valuable, and then kind of discarding the rest.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the ideal mental model. I mean, actually, I do a specific hypnotherapy session with clients where exactly that frame of mind is, what can I take from this experience? And I discard everything else, which is just baggage. Um, and, again, I do believe that is a genuine superpower at the tables. I think the best, and in other competitive realms, the ability to just say, okay, that's an important data point, or that's something important for me to learn. But everything else, any self-criticism beyond that is just self-flagellation. It's not helpful. Just move on, and move on immediately. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you 100% there.
Stephen, it's been great. I've got some lightning round questions to close us down. If you have time, I want to be respectful of your time. We're a little bit over an hour so far. So what's some common poker advice you hear that you completely disagree with?
Let me think. I mean, I've probably touched on it already, which is, I think there are people who, in fact, I'm going to come up with two, actually. I think there were people who just neglect the mental game. They think that what you can do is brute force your way to success through technical knowledge. Technical knowledge, as I've made clear from the outset, is a vital component of any player's development. But I'm still surprised by how many people neglect the impact of the mental game. So I think, the people who say, hey, just grind it out on the solvers, just, watch a million videos, but all this mental stuff is just, so much hot air. I think they're ignoring the reality of the kind of players we've named, successful players who do not neglect that edge. Good players will realize that this makes a real difference. And it makes a difference actually to players pretty well throughout the whole of the population. Sure, the weaker the player you are, the technically, the more you will benefit from technical work. But I can say that pretty commonly, every player has massive mental game leaks, which reduces their ability to perform their best. So that's number one. Number two is, I hear some advice which is maybe applicable to some players at certain points of their career, but not necessarily to everybody. And so there's the phrase, never miss a Sunday. Okay. For the tournament players. I think if you're 23, a professional poker player in single, that's absolutely fine. But if you're 30, 38, a professional poker player, and have a young family, and Sunday is one of the only days you're together, I'd say it's 100% the wrong advice, because there is life outside just grinding. And, your ROI on Sunday, yes, it will be the highest ROI of the week. But, creating a balanced lifestyle, creating sustainability, is actually the key. We're playing the long game here. And, for you to have a sustainable life in poker as a professional, you need to understand, what is your vision of life? How do all the pieces fit together? How does your if you have a family, fit into it? I get plenty of players who've reached a certain point in their poker career who are like, hey, I've made money and I'm doing pretty well, but I feel lonely. And, that's because they've taken that kind of advice too far, that there's no sense of balance in their life. And they get to a point where they actually end up asking, what's this all for? None of this makes sense to me anymore. They got beyond the point where it's like, I've proved that I can grind and win. They've got enough money to pay the rent comfortably and so on, but their life, it can feel a little empty. So I do think that there needs to be more balance in that kind of advice. And I think there's a lot of survivorship bias in that kind of advice. It's like, hey, that's the way I did it. I did it by, playing my sessions and then doing, solving 20 marked hands. And I did that every day. That's not right for everybody. It wouldn't even be necessarily the advice I would give after a long session, by the way. I think the best time to study almost is never straight after a session. If you've put in a long session and you've left it all out there, you're not going to be in the best state to study. You're also going to be emotionally attached to a lot of the hands you've played. So when you actually then come to analyze them, you're going to be tired and you're going to be full of the emotion of the hand. I actually stopped doing that, and then I started looking at my hands. I had all my marked hands, looked at them at a later time in the week, and it was remarkable how often it then became really clear that my decision was this or that when I looked at it in the cold light of day. So I just think there is a tendency, I think, to extrapolate advice from oneself and assume that's got to be right for everybody. And that's not the way to think of it. You've got to actually understand other people have got different lives and different goals. And poker is not the be all and end all in everybody's life. And by the way, if you go down a route where you make it number one to the extent that it undermines, for example, your family life, guess what? You undermine your poker. Having that balance is really important.
Yeah, the most famous example I can think of not having balance was when Brian Hastings beat Isildur out of like $4.5 million, and wrote about it afterwards, and it all went down at like 4 a.m. or something, and he went down to the bar to like celebrate, and he had nobody to call, he had nobody to celebrate with, and he just felt this overwhelming sense of loneliness after what is one of the most legendary nights in online cash game history. But yeah, he just felt sad, which I know everybody on the podcast is certainly going to be shedding lots of tears for the guy that just won $4.5 million, who's celebrating at the bar by himself. But it was a big emotion for him. It was, and I think that it catalyzed a search to add more balance to his life after that night.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, again, in terms of that feeding back into performance, social connection is a flow trigger. So we have no social connection in our life. We are losing a component which, apart from the value of it in itself, is actually going to feed back into high performance. So, one thing I will do with my players is I will look at their whole lives. Now, look, if somebody tells me, look, I'm not interested in meeting anybody, that's okay. I'll listen to that. That's fine. At the end of the day, they make their own choices. But it's remarkable how many people say, you know what, I do feel at times a little bit isolated, and I do feel lonely. And, that is something that needs to be addressed, because it will impact your life outside poker will impact you at the poker tables.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest benefits, in my opinion, of having our Wolf retreats, which is my CFP. Everybody getting together in real life, spending a week or two together, playing poker tournaments, living in a cabin, just socializing. The socialization aspect is the thing that I always come away from the experience feeling like I needed that. I feel refreshed. I feel better. I feel re-energized. The poker just kind of is what it is. It's there. It's a part of the experience, but it's, playing the board games, at 9 p.m. at night until, 11 p.m. or midnight or 1 or whatever it is. And just having that community aspect, the social aspect, that to me is the most valuable portion of the entire experience.
Yeah, I think those kind of exercises are so valuable. They just, obviously from the viewpoint of your team, they're valuable, but as individuals, they're really valuable. It's interesting. I went I was thinking last summer, should I go to the World Series to see some clients? And in the end, I did. It's a long trip and all of that, and I'm so glad I did. You know, some of the clients I met out there, it was the first time I'd ever met them in person. And I'm so glad. It makes such a difference. You know, I do most of my work over the over Zoom, but it's so good to meet people and just see them in a different context. I think that's something I would, I would say to most poker players, are you getting enough social contact? There's lots of things I could say, which are healthy, and you're getting enough exercise, the right kind of exercise, and we get quite granular with some of that stuff, but social connection is vital. Yeah, for sure.
So to summarize, if you have the option of missing a Sunday or spending time with all of your friends that you haven't seen in quite a while, consider choosing the time with the friends that you haven't seen in quite a while.
Absolutely, absolutely. Like I was can think of an example of somebody who actually asked me this question, an MTT player, really, really disciplined professional, and he was having trouble finding time for a date. And I said, skip Sunday, just go on that date. The person who it was, and he doesn't, you know, this was not just like, okay, I go on 12 dates, a month, just give your life a bit of a chance to breathe. It's okay. The Sunday million will be there the next week. It's all right. So yeah, just making sure that element of balance is in your life is I think really important. I mean, look, in the years I played poker, I had my family, but I still think I, could have done with more social connection during that time. And one of the reasons I love my coaching is I get it every day. But even then, it's like nice to go and meet people in person. So yeah, that would be a big takeaway here.
Love it. If you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about poker, what would it be?
I think the growing presence of online bots is a problem. Um, and look, the live game is flourishing. I mean, the live game is really flourishing, and I think it's in extremely rude health. And you know, since I've been playing, it's so many prophets of doom that poker's finished and so on. But there's definitely some sites where they've given up trying. They don't try to deal with the bot problem, and I think it's short sighted. Um, ultimately it'll just be a load of bots playing against a load of bots, and I'm not sure whether the bots will keep playing if that's the case. Uh,
Big psychological effect too of playing against bots that I found in running my CFP. When you don't know whether or not the game is rigged, when you don't know whether or not you're playing against a human, it invites a lot of emotional and psychological negative responses that just makes you feel gross. It makes you not excited to sit down and play poker. You just always have this like sense of unease because you don't know if what you're engaging is on the level.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, look, we've all, historically looked at 2 plus 2, and people will start a thread saying, is this site rigged and is that site rigged? And I used to smile at it, and just say, oh, come on. But when it's pretty clear that some sites are basically allowing bots, then it's not much of a leap of imagination to say, well, if they're prepared to allow that, what else are they prepared to let go by? Um, you know, are they creating, card distributions which are designed to create action pots? What else is out there? And you're right, that does create an incredibly negative experience for the player, because if you sit down and think, well, maybe I don't have a chance in this game. Maybe it really is as bad as all those guys on 2 plus 2 were saying. That's incredibly short-sighted for the whole ecosystem. Yeah.
And I again have always been one to kind of scoff at poker's rigged and all these things, and my response would always be like, wow, that's interesting. I guess like every site I've played on has like been rigged in my favor, so lucky me. But there is this sense that if sites allow bots, if sites are essentially running bots themselves, if they're complicit in adding liquidity to their pool by using bots, and they have a downside risk of using the bots, aka the bots lose money, then it is not crazy to say that, oh, the RNG could be messed with to ensure that the bots win. Right? That's not actually crazy, because the incentive is actually there to prevent the downside risk of the platform itself. And then once you lose trust in your customer base, that should be it for most sites. If there's a competitive, healthy environment and other options for players, for platforms for players to play on, that should be it. Once trust is eroded and the integrity of a platform is in question, and for me, platforms provide a service, right? They provide a service for their players to play on, and it is their responsibility to make sure that the games are clean and that you're playing against real people. And when that's violated, then yeah, the next follow up question is like, well, what else are they willing to do if they don't care about putting on what's a fair game?
Yeah, absolutely. The trouble is as well, they hurt the entire ecosystem. If these sites hurt themselves and disappeared out of existence, great. No problem, no loss. But they hurt the integrity, and you'll speak to people who say, I don't trust online poker. And that's with a broad brush. And that's unfair, but I now understand where it comes from. I am actually, it's interesting. I am now in favor of things like, I mean, I used to historically use a HUD, but now I actually choose not to, and I'm in favor of sites which don't. I think, to be honest with you, I'm actually enjoying playing some live poker these days, and I actually think having a HUD almost diminishes my ability to be observant when I'm playing online. But I think it's good for the ecosystem as well. I've seen people on online posts, somebody puts up a HUD, and people have said underneath, who obviously weren't even aware that these were a thing, saying, well, my goodness, if this is what's happening here, I'm not playing in these games, because there's this sort of Death Star kind of control of all these stats about me. It doesn't feel fair. So I think, I've got a lot of time for the sites which are upholding integrity. But I think more of them need to do it. And I don't know what the future is for those individual sites, but I think they're undermining all of poker by adopting these practices.
No earthly idea what the future of online poker looks like as somebody that's firmly embedded in the world of online poker, but live poker is good. Live poker is flourishing. Live poker is a great environment. I don't think anything's going to happen to live poker in the near or immediate future. The final thing that I'll say on that is that I think we also have a tendency to publicize the negative events in poker way more than the positive things, and that's directly related to human beings having a negativity bias. We're just driven to the negative things, which does create that sense for somebody that doesn't keep up with the things happening in poker, that it's very much doom and gloom, and that things are, on the verge of apocalypse, or that everything is kind of against them every single time they sit down at an online poker table, when, that may not be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And to be absolutely clear, I still play some online poker, and there are good sites out there. I play on without any, obviously affiliation. I play on GG. I know some people have been critical of rake structures and so on, but in terms of the playing experience, and as far as I'm aware, maybe I'll be corrected, integrity, no problem. Poker Stars, no problem. And there'll be others, I know there will. I used to play on Party, to my knowledge, never any problem. So, there's plenty of good experiences out there. And it will be a long time before, well, hopefully it will be never that I stop playing online poker. There are good experiences out there, but I think there's some smaller sites in particular, and some bigger ones as well, where they're not taking the bot problem seriously, and I think they're shooting themselves in the foot.
From the professional player's perspective, I think just a platform trying to, like, things will happen. Bots will get into bots will get into GG. They'll have security breaches. Things will happen, but like, just try your best to like fight against the horde of people that are trying to do shady things. Do your best to get rid of the bots when you see them. Be responsive. Update your protocols. Invest into site security. Just try. Don't just like be like an ostrich and stick your head in the sand and be like, oh,
Absolutely.
whatever happens, happens.
Nobody expects perfection. And I think as long as you see a site is trying, that's just fine. They'll do a pretty good job. And I think those sites I mentioned do.
Nice.
Yeah.
What's a project you're working on that's near and dear to your heart?
Okay, so I am looking to develop a group coaching course in the next year. Obviously the core of my work is one-to-one work. But I'm trying to extend the offering to people so that more people can access it. There will still be, benefits from one-to-one work, but I want to basically create something which entire groups at a time can benefit from, because I think a lot of the stuff is able to be generalized, and then somebody can come to me and say, hey, can you give me a one-to-one session? At the moment, I only ever do groups, one-to-one work on a package basis. But yeah, sort of creating something which allows more people to access this kind of work. I mean, I have to say, I wish I'd had this at an early stage in my entire career, not just my poker career, but right at the beginning of my legal career. But maybe at that stage in my life, I wouldn't have necessarily been able to have afforded one-to-one coaching. So creating group coaching, that's going to be important. The second thing is I do want in 2025 to play more live poker. I was like somebody who, for the majority, in fact, it was overwhelming majority of my time when I was playing was online. I was quite happy that way. I live in the countryside in the UK. It wasn't even very convenient to play live poker. London's 3.5 hours away. I just thought, right, okay, I'm going to play online. And then going to the WSOP last year, actually, in Vegas, made me, there's a buzz, right? There's a buzz. And I just thought, this is awesome. And, since coming home, I've sort of played the UK IPT in London. I played the Battle of Malta. There'll be more I'd like to do. I've got to make sure I keep it all in balance with actually coaching. But yeah, that's going to be a passion project going forward. It's just playing with some more live poker because, yeah, I'm really enjoying it. So that alongside, developing my coaching in a different way with the group coaching, that would be where I hope to go in the next 12 months in particular.
Make sure that I'm one of the first people you reach out to whenever you get your group coaching going, because I think that would be extremely beneficial for my group of players specifically. And yeah, we had last summer I had three students who were actually in like the top 400 in the WSOP main. Two of them were like top 15 in chips. And it got to the point where like, oh, like you last another day, like I'm going to be flying out there to be on your rail. And it was, as somebody that doesn't play tournaments, I was like, I see why people play the main event now. I see why it's such an exciting thing, because like I'm just super pumped for watching my students succeed on, the biggest stage of them all in the game.
I mean, just the buzz of that room or those rooms at Paris and the Horseshoe, and there's like the sound of thousands of people riffling their chips. It's like being in a tropical rainforest and, I don't know, hearing cicadas or something. I don't know whether you find those in a tropical rainforest, but you know what I mean.
Sure.
And it's just, the atmosphere is just magical. So yeah, and as long as stuff like that goes on, poker, particularly live poker, is always going to be thriving because it's just an absolute festival of all the good stuff, right? It's so exciting.
Mix
But
in
yeah,
mix in with a little bit of COVID, which has
yeah,
unfortunately
yeah,
mashed me my last 2 trips to the WSOP. I got the wrong kind of buzz in the group of all the players. But yes, I agree. It's an incredible experience, and I think anybody that's in the space or interested should make the trek at least once in their life to experience the WSOP, because there's really nothing like it. And yeah, final question for the listener who wants to learn more, wants to get some coaching, learn more about what you do. Where can they find you on the World Wide Web?
Okay, the address is www.sbaker.life. So S for Stephen, Baker.life. And anybody listening, if they're interested, can book a free consultation with me there. I'll always give, half an hour and talk through whatever issues that person has, and see if we can help. Feel free to reach out. And you can also see some of the players I've worked with there, as well as people outside poker as well.
Love it. It's been a joy and an honor, and would love to have you again in the future. And thank you very much for your time, Stephen. Great to have you on the show.
Yeah, thank you. The feeling's mutual.
This is Chasing Poker Greatness with your host, Brad Wilson. Coach Brad approved.